Hello and welcome to this A-level history revision video on Henry VIII's later foreign policy. So here's the plan for our session. We'll have a look at Henry's foreign policy aims at the start of his reign and compare them to his later reign. We'll have a look at his capacity for an aggressive foreign policy. Then we'll have a look at his relations with Scotland, France and the Empire, building a timeline of events, and that will lead us finally to a past paper question example. So maybe just to guide your revision, here's the details from the OCR exam board syllabus of the content that we need to know about Henry's later foreign policy. So let's get underway with Henry VIII's early foreign policy aims, and we're going to use these to compare and contrast his early to his later foreign policy. Henry VIII aimed to make his mark as a young king and end the non-interventionism of his father. Henry VII had followed a pacific policy, avoiding war whenever possible. In Henry's world, as a young Renaissance king, an active foreign policy was a chance to make his mark. And furthermore, he could use foreign policy to build his status, both domestically and with his international contemporaries. He also aimed to use his foreign policy to free himself from his ministers' control. Henry VIII had inherited his father's ministers, such as Bishops Warham and Fox, who favoured a peaceful foreign policy and good relations with France. And Henry saw an active foreign policy and aggressive foreign policy as a chance to free himself from their influence. Fourthly, Henry VIII tried to emulate Henry V, who 100 years before him had achieved glory through successful military campaigns in France. And Henry also knew that he could use his foreign policy to pursue his claim to the French throne. This was a historic claim that English kings had held for hundreds of years. It had lapsed in the 15th century, when focus was more on the domestic conflicts of the Wars of the Roses. And lastly, Henry wanted to play the role of a chivalric knight. This was a young king who had been raised on Arthurian legend of heroic knights. And again, in the world of a Renaissance prince, it was expected that a young, physically active and healthy king could lead his troops onto the battlefield successfully. Now you might just want to pause the video for a moment here and see if you can explore the links that exist between these aims. They don't operate in isolation. So maybe just press pause and then press play again when you're ready. So let's have a look at Henry VIII's later foreign policy aims and see how they compare and contrast. We'll see if there's change or continuity between those and his early foreign policy aims. So I think that Henry was still looking to make his mark. The 1530s had been a decade of non-interventionism. Henry had concentrated on domestic affairs. Foreign policy had been defensive. So in his later years, an aggressive foreign policy would be a chance to reimpose himself on the international stage, which would build his status. And again, Henry's domestic and international reputation were a concern. In his later years, Henry was still attempting to be free from his ministers' control. As his powers, physical and mental, were slowly weakening, Henry needed to control his factions that operated at court and display his prowess, and an aggressive foreign policy would be an ideal tool to do that. He was still looking to emulate Henry V. His health was failing, and he knew that time was running short if he was going to be able to take part personally on a successful military campaign against France. The English king's claim to the French throne had not got very far during Henry's reign thus far. It had been frustrated in the 1520s when money had run short, leaving Henry unable to intervene after 1525. And Henry had only had a limited opportunity to play the role of a chivalric knight. He had achieved some battlefield glory early in his reign, but this had been frustrated for a good nearly 30 years. So just pause the video if you'd like to, and repeat that exercise of exploring the links that exist between the aims of Henry's later foreign policy. So maybe just press pause and then press play when you're ready to resume. So next, let's have a look at Henry's capacity for an aggressive foreign policy. Now, coming into the 1540s, Henry was in a more secure position in a number of ways, and this created the scope for more aggression abroad. Firstly, financially, Henry had the means to fight wars. The profits from the monastic lands were pouring in, and this gave Henry the cash that he needed to play a part on the continent. Secondly, in the 1540s, there was a more settled situation at home. The religious changes of the 1530s had been carried out. The Act of Six Articles had established a conservative religious position, and this meant that Henry faced less opposition. So the domestic political situation was calmer. And thirdly, the succession had also been settled. Henry's son Edward was through his most dangerous years of infancy, and in 1543 Henry's daughters Mary and Elizabeth were legitimised, and the succession to the throne was made clear. So overall, the picture is more stable, and it's certainly more financially viable for Henry to play a part in an aggressive foreign policy. So next, let's have a look at the context of the major powers that Henry would be interacting with in his foreign policy. So firstly, let's have a look at Scotland, a power that became increasingly important in English foreign policy in the 1540s. So Scotland was ruled by James V, who was Henry VIII's nephew, who was a younger but confident and dynamic ruler. And James led Scotland towards a pro-French, anti-English position, restoring the old alliance. And James had married into the French royal family, firstly the Valois family and then secondly the Guise family. His increasingly anti-English position can be seen by the fact that he sheltered Pilgrimage of Grace rebels in 1536, and the Scottish line was ignored in Henry VIII's will. Next, let's have a look at France, which was still ruled by Francis I, who was a rich, powerful, and entirely secure king. Francis's main concerns were his rivalry with the Holy Roman Emperor over Italian lands. Usually, the two were enemies, but occasionally in the 1530s, when relations were better, the threat of a combined Catholic crusade against England formed, and this directed a lot of English fears and concerns and policies in the 1530s. So throughout the 1530s, Henry had sought friendship with Francis as his own relations with the emperor deteriorated. Lastly, let's look at the Holy Roman Empire and Spain. ruled by Charles V, also rich, powerful, and entirely secure. Now, Charles had spent the 1530s mostly at war, defending his lands against the French and also the Turkish threat in the east. Relations with the empire had slowly started to recover after the death of Catherine of Aragon in 1536. So let's build a timeline of events after 1540. So we'll start with 1541, which saw the death of Margaret Tudor and the York snub. In 1541, Margaret Tudor died. So this is James V's mother and Henry VIII's sister, and her death removed the reason for peace between Scotland and England. And war became even more likely when James V snubbed Henry VIII by failing to appear at a planned meeting in York, which Henry VIII took as a personal insult. And this accelerated the tension between the two kings into conflict. 1542 saw an Anglo-Imperial agreement, the Battle of Solway Moss, and the death of James V. So the Anglo-Imperial alliance really resulted from French and imperial tensions over Italy. So this marks the return of the traditional Henry VIII foreign policy position, which is anti-French and pro-empire. In this year, a pitched battle took place on the Scottish-English border at Solway Moss, and this was a crushing victory for the English. And this was soon followed by the death of James V. This left Scotland in the hands of his days-old daughter Mary. So 1542 is a catastrophic year for Scotland and fundamentally changes the balance between Scotland and England in England's favour. 1543 saw the Treaty of Greenwich and an invasion agreement between the Empire and England. So the Treaty of Greenwich shows England's dominance over Scotland after the Battle of Solway Moss. It established peace between the two countries and also arranged for the marriage between Henry VIII's son Edward and the infant Queen of Scotland Mary, but the terms were unbalanced, strongly in England's favour. For example, Mary was to be delivered to England at the age of 10. So the Scottish Parliament rejected the treaty. Also in 1543, a French invasion was agreed between Charles V and Henry VIII. They agreed to both supply substantial forces and advance from the north of France to try to take Paris. 1544 saw an invasion of France, the capture of Boulogne, and the start of the rough wooing. So in 1544, England invaded France, as agreed, and Henry personally led the army on campaign. Now this was against the wishes and advice of Charles V, who thought that Henry would be a distraction and would impede a successful military campaign. But Henry insisted on going, and this gives you an idea of Henry's desire for more military glory. And the campaign was successful. It was incredibly expensive, but it did result in the capture of the key port of Boulogne. And having achieved this, Henry VIII returned home, leaving his army under the leadership of the Dukes of Norfolk and Suffolk. Meanwhile, closer to home, the rough wooing began. This was a series of raids and battles by the English forces led by Edward Seymour, the Earl of Hertford, and John Dudley, Viscount Lisle, in an attempt to force the Scottish Parliament to agree to the terms imposed on them under the Treaty of Greenwich. But all this resulted in was more determination by the Scots to refuse to buckle to English pressure. But of course, Seymour and Dudley would go on to be really important in the reign of Edward VI, and their involvement in this campaign really marks their ascent as key military and hence political leaders of future years. 1545 saw the French raid on the Solent and the sinking of the Mary Rose. Now, this is spectacular. It's of no great military significance. The French raid is unsuccessful, despite repeated landings. But this indicates the importance that Francis I placed on the loss of Boulogne. The aim was really to pressurise Henry into giving up Boulogne. We remember this in English history, of course, because the flagship Mary Rose sinks. And you can just see that happening in the image at the top. So 1546 saw the withdrawal of Charles V from the French war, and then the Treaty of Camp or Ard. So in 1546, Charles V unexpectedly and without Henry's agreement withdrew from the war with France. Now this should be a familiar theme to you. We've seen this happen several times across Henry's reign, with Henry being let down by his allies. And Charles' withdrawal left England isolated and threatened by the old alliance of Scotland and France. So this forced Henry to come to terms with France, and the Treaty of Camp or Ard, they're one and the same thing, arranged for the retention of Boulogne by England until 1554, when it would be sold back to the French for an enormous sum of money. And it also agreed that the French pension paid to the English king by France would resume. So this slide might be of use to you. This is just our timeline put into strands of Scotland, France and the Empire. There's nothing new here in terms of what we've discussed and presented, but this might give you an idea of how to shred this into three separate areas. Okay, so lastly, let's have a look at an example of a past paper question on this content. So in the 2018 paper, we had assessed the reasons why England was at war with France and Scotland in the 1540s. Just have a quick look at the examiner's advice. It was particularly pleasing to see the large number who were able to place the events of the 1540s in the wider context of Henry's reign in order to reach a developed judgment. So this is an invitation for you to look at the wider and longer term aims and reasons for Henry's actions. And as ever, with our 20-mark questions, what we need are 3 well-explained reasons, each with its own paragraph. Okay, that brings us to the end of this video. Good luck with your revision.